The surgeon stole my ex's file. I swapped the results. Incurable STD. Say that to a stranger and watch the jaw drop. Say it to a room full of doctors and hospital administrators and they will go pale. Say it into a camera and people will share it because every headline wants a body to land on. Hold that thought. Before anyone imagines me in scrubs with a penknife and a conscience fried to ash, listen to what really happened and why I used every lawful lever I had to make sure one woman lived and one man lost what he had been using as a weapon. I flew in without telling Sterling. I always knew how to move fast when I had to. The last time I'd seen Vada, she was laughing over spilled coffee on my kitchen table, a laugh so thin I told her to slow down, that everything in life didn't have to rush past. This time, the laugh that lived in my head was gone. I brought elderberry jam because that's what her mother sent, and a ragged teddy bear with one eye missing because the hospital room smelled of bleach and beeping machines, and a smudge of softness would help. The apartment was the first strike. The door barely latched, the living room a small storm. A jacket crumpled over the back of a chair, 2 half-drank beers on the coffee table, an expensive bottle of cologne open like a bruise. On the kitchen counter, a small corked bottle of pills lay where someone had dropped it and stopped reaching. The radio, the kind Sterling kept tuned to anything with too many bass beats, was off. The silence in that room was heavy as a thing that had been waiting to be discovered. I called her phone until it went to voicemail. I called Sterling, no answer. I called my daughter, no answer. The city felt too loud and too near. When your fear presents itself like that, you do simple things. You walk straight through the door you are afraid of, and you start looking. What I found in her dresser changed everything. It wasn't just the unpaid notices folded into the back pocket of a jeans drawer. It was the neat little book, something Vada tapped like a map of the parts of her life she didn't want anyone else to see. The entries were short and steady, not dramatic. Small notes about promises broken, about money that didn't go to rent, but to poker nights and fast food for friends, about apologies that arrived late and smelled of the kind of liquor that does not make amends. One page read like this, not verbatim, but with a clarity I couldn't ignore. He says he'll fix it. He says he'll move me out of here into something nice. I've stopped taking my morning pills sometimes because I can live between the sentences of his promises. Another page later was the handwriting smaller, cramped. I left my meds in their bottle. I thought maybe if I didn't have to ask him about it, he'd remember. He didn't. There was a pawn receipt folded into a book of takeout menus, dated back to the same week I'd last seen them. I found a stack of unopened mail, bills, medical statements in a name that wasn't Veda's, but meant nothing to Sterling when he needed to sign something quickly and move on. The pattern read like a cheap crime, neglect dressed up as everyday mismanagement. The pieces were there if you had a mind to put them together. I called the hospital. The emergency department smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. The alderman's office woman on duty, a kind woman with a soft voice named Tasha, guided me down to ICU on a who's who pass and a look that said, "You better have something." I did. When I saw Veda, she looked like someone asleep in a storm. Small hands away from me, lips parted, a paper-thin skin stretched over too much pain. There were tubes, the little adhesive squares stuck to her chest, a monitor that sang a monotonous song. Dr. Dubois stood to the side, a man whose face had the kindness of someone who had seen too much and kept his compassion stored like spare change. He told me what needed to be said, in a voice that was at once gentle and blunt. She'd been admitted late, arrived with complications from prolonged neglect. They were doing what they could. There are moments you can feel in your body where something else clicks into place. The family waiting room felt colder than the rest of the floor. The fluorescent lights hum a little differently. I made decisions then the way I always make them, slow and deliberate, like taking apart a problem and putting each piece on the table. I signed a form to authorize a private nurse on top of the staff they provided. I handed a credit card to the clerk and asked them to use it for what was needed. I called Odora. Odora moved like somebody who had practiced saying no until it became an art. She was a small woman with a legal pad in her jacket and a look that could press a man into the exact place where truth hurt him enough to be honest. "Send me whatever you have," she said, "and don't tell Sterling anything yet." Don't tell Sterling anything yet. Those words were the hinge. Because he wasn't stunned in the apartment. He was somewhere else, living a version of the life he wanted other people to see. I would learn later that he had been in a bar 3 blocks away. his phone tucked in the cup holder of a midnight blue SUV he'd learned to drive like an owner's son. I would learn later that he sent me texts that said, "Pray for us," while the music in the car bragged about a life he hadn't earned. When you learn to see what someone is doing in small acts, the not giving of medicine, the refusing to sign a form, you realize power is mostly a matter of who controls access. Sterling controlled it. He controlled Veda's pills, he controlled entry to the building, he controlled the story we would hand the world. That meant I had to take control of access too. What I didn't do, ever, was break the law. I did not alter medical records. I did not touch lab results. I am not a doctor, and I am not a thief. What I did do was begin a long, polite war in the margins of legal documents and hospital bureaucracy. That war would include naming what had been stolen and by whom, and using the law, not my anger, to sever the tie. But before we got to signatures and deeds and calls to the towing company, there was something else, and that something looked like a deliberate use of the hospital itself as a way to hide wrongs. When Odora asked for Veda's records, the hospital's medical records department told her there was a problem. An active file was missing parts. Not missing because someone had left pages at home, missing in the way a missing wallet is missing, like it had been taken. Later, Dr. Dubois would tell me in a voice that was part shame and part corporate script that sometimes people were careless with files, that the system had weak spots. He used the word audit. I will be honest, when Odora said the word audit, I saw two things happen at once in my mind. One, the ledger of Sterling's life, the receipts, the pawn slip, those would make sense if the hospital records were missing, because the missing file meant the story could be smoothed over. Two, an opportunity was forming where one mistake could reveal another. Who took it? I asked. The nurse didn't know. The clerk said someone from surgery had checked out a hard copy for a consult and it never came back. The words landed like a stone. A surgeon? The man in charge of other people's bodies, the quick decisions people trust, had, according to the paper trail, removed a file that had belonged to a patient they were supposed to serve. Why? For what gain? A mistake? A cover-up? Extortion? At that moment, the title of this video, that shout that gets attention, felt less like something to clap and more like an accusation that needed proof. The surgeon had taken a file. That could be a disastrous criminal thing. It could be the sort of small, rotten habit that ruined a person and exposed a hospital to scandal. We had to know. Odora set a trap of a kind lawyers excel at, not illegal stings, but a lawful pressure campaign that revealed what the hospital preferred to hide. She filed a formal complaint. She requested copies for legal review, for immediate subpoena if necessary. She suggested an internal audit. The administration, which had more to lose than we did, moved with the same clumsy elegance of people who have to protect an institution as though it were a person with fragile pride. That clumsiness, in the end, helped us. A week later, I sat with a woman named Janice from Health Records. She brought a manila folder like a truce. The edges of the folder were taped down, and inside were pages that showed clearly somebody had requested the file, sprawled signatures, and then a note, "For consult, removed." There were timestamps and the names of people who had signed the log. One of those names belonged to a surgeon who had privileges at a clinic in the same network. It was not my job to play detective, it was my job to be ready. Odora told me we had enough to demand an internal investigation. The hospital could either do the right thing and report what had happened, or they could try to bury it. Either way, a file that disappeared because someone in white coats chose to make it disappear was not acceptable. The law would be our lamp. That day I watched Dr. Dubois move through the unit, his hands always with a purpose. Later he admitted, with an apologetic tilt to his mouth, that he'd suspected someone had been grabbing files to hide complications, to shuffle blame, to keep outcomes tidy for the hospital's numbers. "We have surgeons who don't want complications on their record," he said. "It's a brutal pressure, Miss Aaliyah. It's not right." "We're not here to make it pretty," I answered. "We're here to make somebody's life worth fixing." If the surgeon took the file to cover something, what that something was, we couldn't say yet. Maybe it was to keep a costly mistake from turning the hospital scorecard. Maybe it was to hide notes of abuse. Maybe it was nothing more than cowardice dressed as clinical necessity. But whatever the reason, the missing file had a consequence. We couldn't allow it to become another way to silence Vada. So while Odora pressed the hospital, I did the other work heavy-handed mothers learn to do. I found leverage. Sterling had been driving a midnight blue SUV with a vanity plate he treated like armor. It was registered, on paper, to me. Years ago, in a moment of misplaced generosity, a check for helping him get back on his feet, I'd signed the title over to him informally and let the registration lapse into a gray place. I had the original title. It sat in a drawer like a confession. There is a lot of talk these days about how women are taught to be quiet about what they own, how we repair and hold and keep secrets that prop up people who will never thank us. I was done keeping secrets for Sterling. I called the police to report the vehicle's use as unauthorized. I reported it because on paper, ownership still lived with me, and because he had been denying the people who needed the car, the nurses running errands, and the caseworker making trips to specialists, access. The officer who took the report did not laugh. He wrote down the VIN number, and his pen felt like sanction. My action was simple and above board. I used the documents I had. I reported the use of my property without my permission. Sterling texted that afternoon, angry and theatrical. He accused me of betrayal. He accused me of being cruel. He did not step away from the tab on the monitor to see Vada for a while. The messages read like textbook entitlement. Rage, then pleading, then threats, then the graceless assumption we would return to old ways because we always did.
At the same time, Odora prepared something more surgical, a deed of gift, not as a punishment, but as protection. The condo, the place Vada Sterling had been living in, which I had co-signed for years, could be transferred. It was messy and expensive and loud in legal language, but it was honest. Odora put together a document that would make Vada co-owner and, crucially, would remove Sterling's ability to exploit the property as collateral or leverage. The idea was to swap results, not lab results, not something a scalpel could change, but the results of whose name stood on legal paper. In that sense, I swapped the outcome. There are people who will say that transferring title is cruel, or that it is maternal betrayal. To them I say this: the alternative was letting the man who had been living on borrowed respect continue to turn two lives into a currency. You cannot be generous with people who are parasites. You pull them off the coin, and you make the coin belong to the one who needs it. We needed to sell the car to fund Vada's extended care and to secure the condo's title work. That required access to the vehicle and the ability to move it. I could have let the cops impound it and watched the bureaucracy tangle us for weeks. Instead, with paperwork in place and the police report filed, I arranged for the vehicle to be turned over and sold in a legal sale. The money would go to the hospital trust account for Vada's care. No, it wasn't poetic, it was practical. When Sterling learned about the deed and the car, he came back into the hospital like thunder. I was in the corridor when he walked out of the elevator. He had the hunched, petulant look of someone trying to be a man in a suit that was too small for his intentions. He saw me, and for a second, his face was a twig snapping under a boot. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, as if my silence was a crime and his neglect was a right. "I told you once," I said. "You'll remember when Vada wakes up and asks you why you were never there." He offered a torrent of words, accusations about money he'd paid, promises he said he'd kept, the performance of a man who expected applause. He wanted the keys, he wanted the house, he wanted the thing that looked like success. His voice rose, people turned their heads. I read him a paragraph from Vada's diary instead. It's a small thing, the act of reading someone else's handwriting aloud, but it has a power like a witness taking the stand. The corridor grew quieter. The words stacked between us, small confessions about missed doses, small notes about loneliness. People in Screbs heard nakedness they were not trained to translate into rhyme. "You're not the one who decides this," he said. "Mom, you can't just take it all." I looked at him and felt the old mother leash tighten for a beat. I remembered the boy he'd been, sticky with glue and scraped palms, and the ways you soften when you see the child that once needed you. I also remembered the woman he had become, a man whose first instinct in crisis was to look away, then to punish anyone who named his wrongs. I did not soften. "We're doing this for Veda," I said, "not because we want to take from you, because you gave it away." That line was not rhetorical. It was true in the ledger sense and in the moral sense. The surgeon's missing file, meanwhile, had become a separate channel of pressure. The hospital, I will not meme them here, initiated an internal investigation when the paper trail narrowed to 1 or 2 fingerprints. The administrators who had been slow at first started to act with preposterous speed, calling in ethics, bringing in a counselor, and arranging for a formal review. There are ways the powerful make amends. There are also ways they cover. We watched which way they would choose. When the investigation turned up evidence that someone in the surgical department had been removing files for consults that never occurred, the hospital had to react. No one liked bad press. The surgeon in question had a reputation as an old-school doctor who didn't take kindly to oversight. He could be cruel and charming all at once. Dr. Dubois looked weary when he told me they were suspending certain privileges pending review. Privileges suspended is not the same as guilt admitted, but it prevents someone with a pattern from moving easily between patients like a ghost. We did not, at any point, doctor anything. We did not fake results. We did not swap lab reports. I say that plainly because there are headlines that seduce people into believing violence is creative. What I did was use what was available: the law, my name on a title, the ledger of receipts that proved neglect, the hospital's own obligation to keep records. That is how you make an inelegant but legal swap of results. You change who gets access, who gets ownership, who gets to tell the story. Still, the title stuck. People want a spectacle. They want the scandal. So I let the clickbait do its work for a minute, because it brought attention to what the hospital and the system preferred to keep quiet: that sometimes people in white coats will choose their convenience over a patient's welfare. If our words could make them accountable, then a little righteous noise was useful. There was a day I will not forget, the night before Sterling confronted me in the corridor. Dr. Dubois had come to my chair with a paper cup of hospital coffee, which tastes worse than it smells, and sat down like he was offering an armistice. "We found things," he said. "Not everything, but enough. There are names across the log that shouldn't be there. We flagged it. We're doing a full audit." "And Veda?" I asked, because that was always the center. He looked at me like he was measuring a patient, and realized people are patients too. Stabilized, not out of danger, but stable. I folded my hands in my lap. "Then do right by her," I said.
"And tell me the truth if he's involved in anything." He did, and he didn't. He named the procedural holes and the staff who had access. He didn't name the patient whose file had been used as an example, because hospital lawyers make silence into a shield. But the direction was right. The institution had to prove it could be accountable. While the hospital ran its audits and Eudora drafted deeds, the human parts of this story, the small domestic cruelties that become patterns, continued. Sterling tried to guilt his way into a narrative where he was the one who cared, because he could not bear to be cut off from what he considered his. He had no idea how easily his sense of entitlement could be undone with signatures and a firm will. There are stakes to doing this. I did not celebrate the emptiness that replaced his threats. I did not enjoy seeing a man reduced to huffing and renting his temper out in hospital hallways. I simply knew that if I did not act, Veda might die of the slow, patient poison of being disregarded. At night, I would sit in the waiting room with a blanket over my knees and a small notebook where I wrote down every time someone said, "She was seen," or "We'll call you." You keep records of things when the universe is inclined to forget them. It is how you build a case for mercy. People ask me later if it hurt to cut someone off. They asked if I could forgive. There is a cost to being a parent who decides to protect one child by starving another of the comforts he used as weapons. The cost is your own sleep, and the echo of the word mother becoming something colder than you ever expected. I thought of the boy Sterling was, and the man he had tried to become. I thought of Veda, small and steady when she could be, and the way her fingers curled around my hand when she woke from sedation and recognized warmth. There is a particular sound in hospitals that no one prepares you for, the murmur of strangers who have chosen to fight, not for fame, but for a person in front of them. Nurses swap stories in low voices like prayers. Janitors bend to pick up dropped wrappers like an act of dignity. You watch the choreography of people who make a life worth saving when the world seems too eager to discard it. My moves, at the core, were about shifting the choreography of control. The surgeon's missing file was a lever that showed how easily records could be used to rewrite a patient's story. The deed and the sale of the car were levers that removed Sterling's ability to rewrite Veda's life. No scalpel, no theft of lab results, no bravado, just paperwork, pressure, and the refusal to look the other way. And yet, in the space between doing what was right and watching the consequences unfold, there is always a memory of softness. I wonder about Sterling at 3 a.m., arms empty, and how that loneliness curdles him to blame. I wonder if he will ever see that weakness is not an asset, that power thinly worn is ugly.
I think about the weight of being the person who points and says, "Enough." When the sale of the midnight blue SUV went through, I sat in a folding chair outside the dealership while a man in a suit took apart the title and put the money into an account earmarked for Veda's care. It felt like a public, humiliating, tidy thing. Sterling, for his part, showed up late and angry, and then left like a man who had been stripped of a costume he had come to believe was his skin. By then, the hospital's audit had found inconsistencies in records across a few cases. The surgeon who had checked out files was under review. He would later be put on administrative leave while an investigation crawled through his past cases. Not a conviction, not yet, but a pause. And a pause can be a kind of mercy. A pause can prevent more harm until the facts make themselves plain. At night, in the weeks after, I would sit at Veda's bedside and smooth the messy hair away from her forehead. When she slept, the room was quiet and small and full of the smell of lemon-scented hand soap.
When she woke, her eyes were raw and hard and then soft. She kept a gratitude to herself that made me grateful in measure. "You could have left," she said once, voice like gravel. "You didn't." I could have left. Plenty of people told me that in the whispers between the beeping machines. They said, "She's a grown woman," or "Family arises its own way." But families fall apart when we mistake mercy for permission. The mercy I offered Veda had the shape of insistence that she be allowed to recover, insistence that the man who harmed her not make more of her life than he had right to. The legal moves, the hospital pressure, the quiet humiliation of watching a son lose his tools of entitlement, none of it was pretty. None of it made me feel like a righteous avenger. It made me feel like a woman who had read a ledger and decided books could be closed. That is where I will stop for now. With Veda stable, with a deed in process, a car sold, a surgeon under review, and Sterling loud in the corridor but losing his audience. There was a moment before the final act when the hospital held its breath and waited for us to see what we would do next. I wanted to be clear in my own heart about what I had become in that waiting. Not a judge dispensing vengeance, but a mother calculating the costs of being kind in the wrong way. If this story is grabbing you, if it is making something inside you tighten or release, stick around. There is more to what happens in that corridor, and there is a reckoning coming that will not be simple. I'll tell you what the hospital decided, how Eudora built the final papers, and how Veda learned to walk toward a life that would not be defined by someone else's appetite. But know this now, I did not swap medical results. I changed who had access, who had ownership, who told the truth. That kind of swap is legal. It is messy. It costs you things you cannot measure.
And sometimes it is the only way to make room for a life to be saved. When the internal review started to move, it moved like winter thaw. Slow at first, then with a sudden speed that made things shift under your feet. The hospital called a meeting, and I went, because you never let the people whose job it is to protect other people decide things without witnesses. Eudora came with a stack of paperwork that made the lawyers in the room look at each other like sailors who had found a map. They told us they had flagged multiple cases where files had been signed out and not returned, where consults were logged that had no corresponding notes. They confirmed that the log had been altered in at least one place. They could not, at that moment, say whether the missing pages would change clinical decisions. Those were questions only another committee could answer. What they could say was this: someone with surgical privileges had had repeated unsupervised access to files and had not always followed protocol. Protocol matters because protocol is how a system remembers what it did and why it did it. When protocol is ignored, the person left at the end of that loss is the one who suffers. The surgeon was placed on administrative leave. That phrase sounds like a small thing, bureaucratic and harmless, until you watch a man who walked the corridors with a smug sort of certainty shrink away from his usual office and into rooms where people took his phone calls differently. The hospital's PR department sent out language that tried to be neutral and calming. Eudora sent them language that named obligations. We did not file press releases because the point was not to make a spectacle for its own sake. It was to make sure the hospital would not be able to pretend nothing had happened. Someone asked me in that meeting, one of the administrators with their voice poised between apology and legal caution, whether I was afraid of setting a precedent. If you set a precedent, I said, the precedent will be that institutions can ignore the small thefts of dignity that turn into death. I would rather set a precedent that says we hold systems to account before they get to the courthouse. After that, the rest of the work settled into a rhythm as ordinary and as disciplined as a sewing bee. Eudora drew up the deed. The bank account was opened with signatories that would not allow Sterling to touch funds without oversight. The sale proceeds from the SUV were transferred into a trust for Veda's care and eventual independence. Everything was paper and stamps and the long, patient business of undoing what was wrong. What bothered me most at night was not the lawyers or the calls or even Sterling's messages. It was the small private betrayals that had gone unnoticed until they made a person too small to be seen. Veda's diary had been my ledger. It was not designed for courtrooms, but its sentences had the line of truth that makes evidence more useful than testimony.
"He forgets me," she had written. "He chooses the night out over the pill he promised to hand me." That line, small and brutal, rattled in my ribs. It was the sort of ordinary cruelty that accumulates until it becomes lethal. Veda woke slowly. The first time her eyes focused on me, she frowned and then clustered her hands around my fingers like a secret. I had plenty to do: appointments, signatures, meetings, follow-ups.
but none of those were as urgent as learning to be present where she was. Once she could sit up for a little while, the therapist came and showed us exercises that made the hospital feel less like a place of endings and more like an institution of work. Work was healing. Work is also discipline, and discipline was something Veda had had to relearn in the gentlest terms, taking medication on a schedule, holding on to a calendar, keeping appointments because someone depended on you. We found a small apartment near a clinic where the caseworkers worked like midwives, helping people be born into new versions of themselves. Eudora arranged for the deed transfer to be finalized with a closing that felt less dramatic than it would have been on television, but more real. Signatures, notary stamps, a lawyer saying congratulations, with fingers that touched paperwork and not feelings. Veda was listed as co-owner, with provisions that shielded her from predatory loans. The goal was not to put her on a pedestal, but to give her a foundation that could not be used as a weapon against her. Sometimes the practicalities were tedious and small, changing locks, picking out curtains, registering at the clinic. But those small acts were the scaffolding of safety. The first night in the new place, we slept with the windows open to the sound of people living their ordinary lives below. It felt like a city breathing around us with 1,000 small, indifferent acts. But indifferent can also be good when it allows you to rebuild without being watched. Work was the other lever. No one can feel purposeful without some claim to being useful in the world. We found a job for Veda at a community kitchen that taught people to cook food on a budget. It suited her because she liked rhythm and little rules and the comfort of making something honest come out of the simplest ingredients. She learned to make a soup that tasted like childhood for people who had never had enough, and in making that soup, she stitched together parts of herself that Sterling had tried to keep separate and small. Her laughter came back in pieces, first as a short, surprised sound when she succeeded at a tray of pastries, then as a full-bodied laugh when she told me a story about an old man in the kitchen who insisted on stirring even after he'd been told the pot was fine. She learned to answer for herself to a supervisor who became a kind of mentor. She found friends who were not invested in her past.
The new apartment held a stack of notebooks, and she filled them with small plans. Pay the copay, make an appointment, save a small amount each month. The ledger that had once been a catalog of losses now included goals. Sterling fell into a different kind of life. After the sale of the SUV and the loss of the privileges he had taken for granted, he did not go quietly into the recalibrated version of himself. He thundered and pleaded and tried all the old tricks. When those did not work, the world forced him into work he had not prepared for. He took a job washing cars at a lot near a highway, a place where engines hissed and daytime workers counted their tips in a steady, honest way. His hands, used to a different kind of currency, learned to scrub with a new rhythm. There was a small dignity in it. Honest labor is a kind of truth that eventually reshapes a person if they accept it. He did not accept it at first. He would show up at the hospital sometimes in a disheveled suit, trying the act of being a man he had once been. He would stand in corridors and try to summon the tenderness he had been unwilling to practice. He begged forgiveness with the theatricality of someone performing a role he had not learned. He asked me to hand back a life he had been given and squandered. I would see him, and there would be a flicker of the small boy, sticky with glue and ashamed of scraped knees. Sometimes that flicker made my heart squeeze tight. Other times it made my jaw harden. The cost of saving someone is often the existence of the person you must let go. Forgiveness is a separate work. Forgiveness for him would not be automatic, especially when the person asking had never truly seen the harm he caused. There was a moment almost ritualistic where I met him at the car wash while he worked. He had come in on his lunch break, hair wet, shirt stained with soap. He walked to me like a man who had practiced this speech. He said he had learned his lesson. He said he wanted to be part of Veda's life again. He wanted the keys back. He wanted us to somehow return to the life before the hospital monitors and the diary pages. He said the word family in a sentence meant to be soft. I looked at him and thought about the ways families can be used as weapons. I thought about Veda's hollowed cheeks, the way her voice had gone small before it grew. I thought about the small ledger I kept at my bedside, and all the times I forgave with an asterisk. Conditional love that made people better or simply kept them comfortable. This was not comfort. This was safety. No, I said. It was a simple word and it landed like a hinge. You can help her, but you won't help her by pretending nothing happened. You will show up when she asks you to. You will show up when the work is asked of you. You will not take her trust for granted. You will not expect to get back what you used to have just because you say you are sorry. He tried to bargain.
He tried to bargain with shame and with promises. He tried to be dramatic. He tried to make me soft. He failed at all of it. I will say this plainly. There were nights when I thought I had been too hard. There were nights when the word mother felt heavy and lonely in my mouth. I had imagined a different kind of adulthood for him,
one where he would be embarrassed and quiet, and then grow into something that made me proud. I had not imagined the slow drip of entitlement that could poison someone's heart into thinking they deserved more than they worked for. Perhaps the hardest thing was watching him shrink into his work without making the soul ache of learning visible. He called sometimes, once or twice a month, to ask for small things he might have fixed himself before, a ride to an interview, a favor. I answered only when it did not mean giving him tools that would be used to hurt. We spoke a few times about rent money for his apartment before he moved out. I helped him through the transition to a place where he could be responsible for his own life, but I did it without returning to the pattern of providing the keys to the kingdom he had misused. The surgeon's suspension stretched into months. The hospital's audit committee reviewed files and policies and made recommendations that would require changes in how records were handled. They promised new training and audits and an internal ethics representative whose job would be to ensure that consults were documented and that files stayed where they belonged. That kind of institutional change is tedious and necessary. It is the work of bureaucracy that can save lives when it is done with honesty. I do not pretend it was lightning. It was, however, a response, one that made it more difficult for a person to make a file vanish, and with it the record of what had been done. After the immediate danger passed, the moral reckoning arrived like rain after a heat wave, refreshing and messily restorative. People asked me if I regretted the legal moves, if I had become a woman who would weaponize love. I said the truth, which is that I had become a woman who learned that love that lets harm continue is not love in any meaningful sense. I had learned that love without boundaries is complicity. Veda came to understand that too. Her gratitude was not something that made me feel like a martyr. It was simply the steady warmth of someone who had received a second chance and took it. She went to therapy, and sometimes the sessions were small and fierce. She learned boundaries, how to say no without trembling, how to count on her own instincts before allowing someone else's charisma to override them. She learned to answer for her own bills. She learned that independence was not a punishment, but a kind of dignity.
We didn't go to church every Sunday in an overt way. Our faith showed up in other rooms. The caseworker who stayed late to find a grant, the neighbor who brought extra lasagna, the volunteer who taught Vada to fold towels in precise little squares. There was a chosen family that formed in soft, practical ways. People who came with soup and stayed with job leads, who visited when bills arrived, who clapped when Vada completed a course at the community college. That kind of love is often better than the one given by biology alone, because it comes with accountability. The media didn't make a circus out of us. A local paper ran a piece on institutional accountability and quoted Dr. Dubois on the pressure surgeons face when outcomes become numbers. Odora was quoted on the power of legal oversight. The surgeon's name was not in headlines that sought to humiliate. He was a man under review, which is sometimes the only humane thing an institution can afford someone who is, perhaps, both capable of care and careless of the rules that keep others safe. I made sure our story never hinged on a single enemy to be destroyed. Systems, not only people, can be the problem. There were nights when I woke with a small, sharp ache that felt like guilt. It wasn't guilt in the way people imagine. It was not the guilt of wrongdoing, because we had operated inside the law, but the deeper ache of parenthood, where you are allowed to love a child and still be the one who limits them. I would lie awake and imagine all the possible futures Sterling could have if he chose differently. I persisted in believing people could change. I also persisted in understanding that hope is not a license to ignore harm. Months later, he came to Vada's apartment for a brief visit that was carefully negotiated. He stood in the hallway like a man uncertain of his welcome. Vada answered the door herself. The sight of him made her look for a moment like someone steeling themselves for a test. He asked for forgiveness in that clumsy, earnest way he had used before, only this time the words were quieter. He brought flowers that were cheap enough to be sincere. They spoke for a while. I waited in the kitchen, washing a dish, listening to the small sound of them using phrases that once would have concluded in an argument. They didn't reconcile that day. They agreed to a slow, supervised pattern of contact. If there is a mercy in this, it is that reconciliation, when it happens, must be earned. She told him simply that trust would be rebuilt by things small and true, showing up for appointments, paying one's share of the rent, attending a meeting with her counselor if she asked. He nodded. The meeting did not solve everything. It started something. There are consequences that come without moral flourish. Sterling got a tattooed job on a lot. His social standing diminished among friends who had been more attracted to his performance than his character. He got better at budgeting because he had to.
He took classes at a community college that gave night courses in things like automotive mechanics. He learned to respect time. He had humiliating moments. People recognized him in the grocery store, and a few whispered about the son of a woman who had taken the keys. Those whispers are a kind of social sanction, and social sanction is real. It is the cost of having been given a position and abusing it. For my part, I learned to sleep through the small noises of the apartment that had once been filled with other people's music and other people's debts. I sat on the balcony and watched the street below, people coming and going with the ordinary business of lives. There was comfort in ordinariness. There was consolation in the hum of a life that continues even when you make hard decisions. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the hospital's ethics office acknowledging our role in bringing certain irregularities to light. It was bureaucratic and official, and the sort of thing that makes advocates feel like their work is part of a machine. The surgeon was still under review. The hospital had committed to improved records control. There was no parade. There was only the steady, sometimes unspectacular, movement of institutions correcting themselves when pressure is applied. I never felt celebratory about his suspension. I felt cautious relief. I felt hope that the hospital would do better by other patients. I felt, too, the private knowledge that if we had not looked, if the file had remained missing, and the ledger of small neglect had been altered into something less visible, then Veda's story could have read differently. It could have been another erasure in a long line of people who were ignored until something irreversible happened. There is a peculiar clarity that comes with making a hard choice and then living with its consequences. People wanted me to be theatrical in describing my victory. The deed, the sale, the shaken sun. They wanted an image of a woman with a raised fist. My victory was quieter. It was the moment Veda walked from the kitchen to the front door and carried her own bag of groceries without me offering to take it. It was the set of small, responsible things she did that were once someone else's job. I think of the night Veda laughed in my kitchen at something small, how the sound made me feel like I had unearthed a bird. I think about the times I called her in the morning to make sure she had taken her medications, and she would answer with a joke. I kept a stack of pictures in a drawer. Veda with flour on her nose, Veda holding a certificate from a course, Veda with a coworker who had become a friend. Evidence of life rebuilt. Friendship formed where family had failed. Neighbors who once were small and quiet showed up with casseroles. A woman from the community kitchen invited Veda to co-host a small class on cooking. The job offered a little paycheck and a sense of schedule that became an honest backbone.
There was dignity in that rhythm. When people ask if I regret what I did to my son, I answer honestly. I regret the ways my actions may hurt him, because hurting the person you raised never feels good. I do not regret the outcome, that someone who was being harmed had a chance to get well. The arithmetic of love is complicated. Sometimes you subtract one relationship to save another. That subtraction is a moral calculus that leaves you raw. You learn to live with the rawness because rawness is the honest place the rest of the heart grows from. There were other documents that made the truth of our decision public. A judge signed off on a conservatorship arrangement for the trust that held Veda's funds. Practical things. Court-approved structures that limited one person's access to someone else's resources. It was not punitive, it was protective. The court did not take pleasure in our story. The court took the work seriously and made a ruling designed to keep a vulnerable person safe. That felt, in a way I had not expected, like the law doing what it was meant to do, stepping in when private arrangements were not protecting the vulnerable. In the quiet of late nights, I would look at myself in the bathroom mirror, and sometimes not recognize the woman who had learned to be ruthless in paperwork. I had become someone who could sign a deed and also make soup. Both of those things exist in the same chest. They are not contradictory. They are the measures of someone who wants to keep both justice and kindness in balance. There was one last meeting with the hospital that mattered to me, a small group in an admin office where they outlined new protocols. They were making changes to their record system, some procedural, some technological. Dr. Dubois spoke for a while about the necessity of transparency and how the pressure of outcomes should never override patient safety. I listened. I did not expect grace. I expected accountability. They promised both. And somewhere between the oddities of bureaucratic language and the everyday act of pressing phone calls, life resumed its steady, imperfect course. Veda moved into a more stable job. Her face relaxed in a way that made me trust our choices. Sterling, for his part, learned to show up in small, non-performative ways when he was invited. He still had a lot to answer for, and there were limits.
Those limits were not punishments so much as boundaries that protected a woman who had already been used as a stage. People asked if I had become cold. I said no. I had simply stopped confusing warmth with enabling. You can love someone and still say no. In fact, sometimes no is a love stronger than the soft permission that lets harm continue. I think often about the ledger of small things that save someone's life. The pawn receipt that betrayed a pattern of spending, the diary that handed me sentences that made a motive legible, the title in a drawer that I used as a lever.
You can build a life out of small papers if you are willing to read them carefully. You can also dismantle a life with the same paper, but that would be a different story, one I did not tell. When people ask me what I would tell mothers who are watching, I say this: notice the small things. Notice the pills left in the bottle, the unopened mail, the excuses that sound like songs meant to convince you. Notice when love becomes a currency people use and not a shelter they share. When you see harm, act lawfully and act with speed. You do not have to be loud to make a life safe. You have to be steady. Was I right to take those keys? Was I right to sign a deed that moved a home into new hands? Was I right to force a man to rebuild himself outside of the comforts he had been given without earning them? I do not speak as someone who delights in punishment. I speak as someone who saw a life dwindling and did not think mercy meant permission. My moral choice was to tilt the world back towards someone who might yet live long enough to tell her own story without being interrupted by another person's appetite. The surgeon's case is still a cautionary tale in local medical circles. He was placed on administrative leave, referred for review by the state board, and the hospital adopted new record-keeping practices. Those changes will not undo years of small corruptions in other places, but they are better than silence. They are part of a broader moment where institutions must be reminded, again and again, that dignity is not an optional part of care. As for me, I learned to let nights be nights again. I learned to tie my life to people who kept their promises. I learned that love can be tough and tender at the same time, that the two are not mutually exclusive. I learned that sometimes saving a life requires paperwork and lawyers and a willingness to be the person who makes the hard phone calls. If you're still with me, here's what I would ask you to do. Tell me what you think. Was the mother right? Did she become someone too hard or someone necessary? Share your thoughts in the comments, because these are not easy questions, and we need the sound of other people thinking them through. If this story moved you, like and share it with someone who needs to hear that hard choices are sometimes the only way to protect a life. And if you want more stories like this, stories about accountability, survival, and the messy grace of second chances, consider subscribing so these voices keep being heard.